You know what I love about this style of graphics? It never gets old. Even nowadays, almost 2 decades after the release of this Hobbit game, you look around and everything is just so lovely, so beautiful, so oh my god, what the hell is that?
Have some berry crumble tea cakes. I made 'em fresh this morning.
He was quite an adventurous Hobbit. Won the Battle of the Greenfields, he did.
Well, except that. That doesn't age well. Though to be fair, this wouldn't feel appropriate even back in 2003. The Hobbit game itself has better mouth animations with Bilbo, whose face is quite expressive all around, and in other cases beards help to hide mouth animation flaws that some characters might have. It is entirely understandable why The Hobbit has these issues though. Created by the sadly now defunct Inevitable Entertainment, The Hobbit had a pretty turbulent development history. This project took 2.5 years to make, and not only did the communication with Tolkien Estate, which required approval on so many aspects, slow down pretty much everything really, there was also a matter of separation between the movie and book licenses. At the time, EA had the rights to do everything related to the movies, while Vivendi held the rights only for the book material. This also meant that the developers couldn't really make anything that would look too similar to their movie counterparts. But also, to top it all off, in a matter of 2 years due to frequent changes in the management team, this Hobbit project transformed from a Japanese-style RPG with stealth and very small focus on combat into a cute platformer with a lot of action elements. With that in mind, I'm actually very surprised that the console and PC versions of the game include absolutely the same mechanics and content. Back in the day, there were so many projects that would share the name and release date, but had considerable differences between platforms, sometimes to the point of being actually absolutely unrelated games. And here, outside of some relatively minor graphical changes and a couple control differences if you're playing on a computer with a keyboard and not a controller, the PC, GameCube, Xbox and PS2 versions are all the same. Well, there's also the GBA version, which will be discussed in a separate video. Obviously, that handheld title is nothing like the console version, but relatively speaking, this type of platform consistency is pretty surprising, especially for a licensed title. Without further ado, let's delve right in. My name is Stanislav Costiuc, I am a game designer, and this is my review of The Hobbit, which as always will do with the help of my Stasocritic scoring system, starting with design. This is the most important part of Stasocritic with the biggest weight, for, as experience a game provides, is defined by how it's played and structured. The Hobbit, for all intents and purposes, is a pretty classic platformer. It doesn't feel like it was inspired by the more child-friendly version of the source material's Middle-earth. More like this type of game just happened to fit. Nothing from the source material ever explicitly creates a need for platforming, which is one of the game's core pillars, but it does allow you to explore the wondrous world of Tolkien's legendarium. As such, collectibles, which are pretty important as well, really exist for an additional reason for you to go around every nook and cranny, although there is a light progression system that they're also useful for. And finally, there's action. And by this I don't mean combat. While there is quite a lot of fighting, The Hobbit doesn't focus enough on it to be a pillar. There's quite a lot of puzzly situations, but again, The Hobbit doesn't focus enough on them. There are side quests, but their importance varies from level to level. Some can have a dozen, while others none. As such, all this can be summarized into something more general. Action. Something that you have to do within the world you'll be jumping around in. On one hand, it is questionable whether such a broad term deserves to be called a pillar, but I would say yes, because with the way the levels are structured, it is clear that it is very important for The Hobbit to not be just about platforming. This is most likely caused by the fact that platforming mechanics in The Hobbit lack a certain amount of depth. There's only 2 jumping actions, for example, the standard one and long jump, alongside some other special cases like climbing on ropes. Sadly, the game lacks coyote jump, meaning the ability to jump after slightly getting off a platform, and sometimes it can be annoying, but honestly most of the time it doesn't become a problem. Besides, The Hobbit does feature a number of other really helpful details, like automatically snapping Bilbo to nearby ledges and ropes while midair, so you rarely feel like the jumps are unfair or imprecise. It's more like they're not an inherently enjoyable activity. This doesn't make a game inherently bad, it's just that in such situations enjoyment must come out of things surrounding the platform and gameplay rather than the mechanics themselves. In this case, level design. And the levels in The Hobbit are, quite frankly, absolutely fantastic. It starts pretty simple in the Shire, which can essentially be described as a main road with some protruding paths that lead to completion of various main or side quests, predominantly side ones. But even this starting area makes things interesting by putting the aforementioned main road in a wavy way throughout a hilly environment, which adds a little bit of verticality. And there are locations like the watermill where you don't need to follow the obvious but a bit longer path to get to the top, which already shows how even at this stage the freedom of approach is ingrained into the level design despite the simplistic jumping mechanics. And the Shire in particular balances out a relatively simple layout with the sheer amount of things you can do. From playing hide and seek with some creepy looking hobbit children and throwing rocks to get apples, to some stealth sections where you have to get some chicken eggs without making a sound, to collecting berries around a garden without getting caught. Now, stealth segments in such a style of action-adventure games that aren't built specifically for sneaking are usually pretty horrible, so knowing that The Hobbit features quite a lot of those can fill one with dread. But do not fret, as the stealth segments in this game are actually fine. This is because of two things, really. First, in any stealth segment there is a clear, distinct indication of which surfaces will make loud noises and which won't, ranging from squeaky planks to leaves to piles of gold. Second, any line of sight breakers behind which you can hide are also very clearly and explicitly defined, be it grass hedges, boxes, some natural terrain, or the longest yawn you will ever hear in your life. And finally, in the middle of the game, you will get the ring that makes you invisible for a limited amount of time, which means that sometimes you don't even have to worry about actually sneaking and can just run about with the guards wondering what the hell is going on. So the stealth segments or entire stealth-based levels that are added for the purposes of variety are actually enjoyable because they're well built and everything is clearly defined. And the two previously mentioned principles of verticality and multiple potential pathways keep evolving as the game goes on. For example, let's take the beginning of the roast mutton level, which comes immediately after the Shire. From the starting area, you descend into a little valley where you will pass by cliffs that you will have to reach in a bit. After climbing toward that higher terrain, you actually have three choices where to go. One where you jump over the valley you've been in, which will continue your main path, but also you can search for an optional chest, as well as climb even higher to get a Burberry that you need to bring to Keeley in the starting area to complete a side quest. The starting area is right below the Burberry location, and once you complete the quest, you don't have to go the whole long way around you did to get back to the main path, as there is going to be a rope shortcut this time, so you can easily continue on your merry way further. Of course, this is only a little example of verticality, circular design and openness, but The Hobbit uses these same principles to gradually build more complex levels as you progress. In the middle of the game you get to pretty massive interconnected environments, like the Riddle in the Dark level with tons of moving machinery, minecart riding that can take you to different places, and quite a big amount of alternative paths. If you understand and analyze the surrounding environments, you can even skip whole sections of the level, a bunch of enemies including, by taking some riskier jumps. One can say that this aspect goes a little bit in conflict with the collectible part of the game. Throughout the levels you will be collecting a lot of coins and courage points in a pretty satisfying manner too. Everything flies into Bilbo's pockets when you're close enough, you don't actually have to actively touch everything. Courage points increase your health, while coins let you purchase pouch upgrades, potions and keys that allow you to bypass the chest pick-locking minigame. Which, by the way, is actually a pretty fun minigame about a set of various little challenges where you have to press the button at the right moments within a limited amount of time. Because this is neither realistic lockpicking where you'll have to fiddle around, nor is it a puzzle, it never detracts from the overall pacing of the experience. Of course, what's in these chests is usually also most of the time collectible coins and courage points. You don't need to get absolutely everything to be able to comfortably play the game, even though both potions and antidotes are fairly useful. But this is why I would say that there is actually no conflict between the increase in freedom in level design to the point of being able to skip entire sections and the collectathon aspect of the game. It all depends on what you prioritize and whether you have completionist desires. Far more important for completion collectibles are special training scrolls that you can find across various levels. They increase the damage you can do with rocks, add more hits to your weapon attack chains, as well as add a spin attack. The combat in this game can be described as functional. It actually has all the necessary for the game mechanics, it's just that they're somewhat clunky. For example, to block you have to move backwards, which is not intuitive in the midst of battle with potentially multiple enemies surrounding you. There's a lock-on feature which is great, but you can't easily switch targets. Even if you lock off and lock on again, you're likely to target the same enemy. As such, reprioritization on the fly is very cumbersome. That being said, the enemy design for the most part is also simplistic enough that you can get through with the most basic attacks anyway, although sting jump attacks are good for breaking shields, while different rock throw and power-ups can be very useful as well. But fighting never becomes something truly enjoyable, even in the few boss battles that the game has, which are a bit more advanced encounters than others. Combat is more like a means to vary up the pacing, like I've mentioned before, some additional actions that you can do between platforming and exploration, which in turn are really the main meat of the game and the larger focus of most levels. And that's a good thing too, because level design is what the Hobbit excels at. Should you open up all the scores for design, I will assign an 8, because as wonderful as the levels are, one of their biggest strengths is in making the otherwise lacking depth jumping mechanics enjoyable, and being very smart about spreading out the quite basic and oftentimes clunky combat mechanics so they would appear as reasonable pace breakers. But make no mistake, while in its current state there is a bit too many flaws that affect the entire experience, with additional mechanical polish, the Hobbit would definitely be able to reach exemplary status. Now, let's talk about context. This category has the weight of 1 as it's about aspects that enhance the gaming experience and don't necessarily define it. Motivation, plot, character arcs, etc. The source material can be called a simple and straightforward story, but it hasn't focused two particularly poignant topics: Bilbo's personal growth into a hero with a strong sense of identity and morality, and the theme of greed, which appears in many forms. The main antagonist, Dragon Smaug, is a pure manifestation of that greed, but the reason why he was successful at capturing the home of the dwarves is because they themselves were prone to it, something that comes into play close to the end of the story with some important character development. And of course, the ring, which in the context of the Hobbit story represents greed of one particular peculiar creature. The Hobbit game sort of loses these themes, although in some way that's because the chosen gameplay doesn't entirely support them. Bilbo's personal growth is practically non-existent. While the fellow did faint at the beginning, that's the only remnants of any of his doubts from the source material. Otherwise, he's extremely determined from the get-go, immediately ready to face all the hardships and doing quite a lot of heroic actions.
I'll show him if I have to walk to the east of East and fight the wild wereworms in the last desert.
For now, you'll just have to walk to the Green Dragon Inn. The dwarves are waiting.
In that sense, the moments when some of the dwarves doubt Bilbo in the earlier parts of the story feel somewhat strange. The aspect of greed is even stranger considering that throughout the game we're collecting coins and gems. Yeah, the gems are technically courage points, but come on, they look like precious stones. So in a story that shows the dangers of greed, we're collecting as much money as we can find. A bit out of place. That said, even though the lack of source material's themes does mean that the Hobbit game becomes a pretty by-the-book heroic adventure, the overall plot is adapted fairly well, with all important moments represented and accounted for, with the exception of meeting Bjorn before entering Mirkwood, which makes his appearance at the end a bit sudden, but to the game's credit, it doesn't act like they've met before.
I'm Bilbo. I have a message from Gandalf.
I thought he might send someone a little bigger.
The writing in general is very enjoyable. A bunch of it is taken out straight from the book, of course, but the parts that are new fit just right in. It is also really appreciated how The Hobbit tries to create some connections to The Lord of the Rings. Not only will Gloin mention his son Gimli, but you will also meet Sam Gamgee's father as a child, see Legolas alongside his father Thranduil, and hear them discussing the actions of the White Council. The Witch King will be referenced. There's a lot of little details that, if you're a Tolkien fan, you're going to be happy to notice, and if you're not, well, the fabric of the world is still going to feel a little bit deeper because of these aspects. That being said, even the weirder elements of the Hobbit book have been kept, like the Tolkien purse, which might raise some eyebrows, but also I sort of like that it was included.
Here, who are you?
Some roles from the book have been expanded. For example, we'll spend much more time with Bard, which I feel is important considering that he's going to be the person to actually shoot Smaug. And you will interact with all the dwarves much more than what we've seen in the book, where really the only dwarf that mattered was Thorin. And I guess Bombur because he was fat and it was enough to be a memorable defining characteristic, just to understand how interchangeable all the other dwarves were. To be honest, they're interchangeable here as well, but due to them having a bunch of optional dialogue and also being quest givers in various levels, you get to feel like you're actually a part of that group. Though it is sort of weird that a lot of relationship development is actually relegated to absolutely new characters introduced for the game specifically. The most prominent being Lyanna, whom you save at one point, and later in Thranduil's palace she repays the debt by helping you save the dwarves, while also participating in the Battle of the Five Armies at the end. The human Corvin gets less screen time, but you also help him out in Mirkwood before his eventual appearance in the Battle of the Five Armies. And then there's an absolutely new dwarf Balfour that you get to help out in the Misty Mountains and who will also help you escape, but then is never seen again. I know there's enough dwarves in the game already, but with such treatment it feels like the game has something against them, doesn't it? Even Thorin doesn't seem to get enough screen time in comparison to Lyanna, because some of the most important moments with him actually happen in the narrated cutscenes and not in the game proper with dialogue and everything. So, should we open up all the scores for context, I will assign a 7. The Hobbit game is a solid adaptation of the source material's plot, it has good writing, a bunch of nice world and character building moments, but also it lacks themes from the book and the way it handles some of the characters, both new and old, at times is quite weird and not totally fulfilling, though none of these problems make the story bad or not enjoyable. Time to discuss aesthetics. This is another category with the weight of 1, as it's again about things that enhance the experience rather than define it, this time through visual style, music, sounds, etc. Now, I know I've made some fun on this topic at the beginning of the video, and look, the mouths on a certain amount of mostly beardless side characters are a problem. But I would go as far as say that this is the only problem the game has aesthetically speaking, really. And even then, the more prominent side characters get proper mouths and respective animations, and then we have Bilbo, who is one incredibly expressive hobbit. Just look at the amount of life and detail in his expressions and eye movement and body language. And also what I've said in the beginning about this visual style being timeless is absolutely true as well. Not only does the game feel like it's straight out of a children's adventure tale with its eye-pop and color palette that also doesn't feel gnarly since various colors complement each other, it also just looks good even for modern times, with each level feeling very distinct. From the peaceful hills of the Shire to the magnificence of dwarven craft inside Erebor. And this is another aspect that The Hobbit represents very well, the various cultures that Bilbo will have the chance to interact with. All this visual splendor is accompanied by great voice acting, very good sound design, but a special mention should definitely go to the music. When the main menu opens up and you hear this, you know you're in for some special musical treatment. every musical track fits the location it sounds in perfectly, again, ranging from the Shire to the adventurous combat music, to the ambience of Lake Town, I mean, I could really go on. Every piece of music in this game is absolutely fantastic. The question then would be, is the moth problem big enough that it makes you feel like the Hobbit lacks polish in the aesthetics area? No, absolutely not, which is why I definitely feel comfortable with assigning at 10. Distinct visual style, quality voice acting, expressive animations, absolutely amazing music, The Hobbit definitely has it all. Now it's time to tackle Cohesion. This category has a weight of 2 and it's focused on examining how well a game connects everything together into a singular, wholesome experience. Now, it is absolutely undeniable that the game tries to put you into the world of the Hobbit and the shoes of Bilbo Baggins. The way you start at a table to then look at hand-drawn pictures in a book as the narrator tells the story of Bilbo Baggins before eventually getting transferred inside that book, inside that world, with all the various world-building mechanisms I have mentioned in the context section, do make you feel pretty immersed in this fairy tale experience. It is very atmospheric in that sense. But then there is just all this stuff that exists simply because it's a game. Like the gems, which increase your health, with only but a pretty hand-wavy attempt to make them fit by calling them courage points. Yeah, right, they're gems. The abstract vendor who sells stuff between missions, the fire and ice rock power-ups. They're related to the needs of the genre, not to the needs of the Hobbit experience. Some abstractions are a bit more forgivable, like the lockpicking minigame. Mechanically, it doesn't have anything to do with how lockpicking would feel, but conceptually it makes sense in the context of Bilbo attempting to prove himself as a worthy burglar, so stuff like that still doesn't feel out of place. However, should we open up all the scores for Cohesion, I will assign a 6. The Hobbit features a number of pretty immersive factors, but the arbitrary mechanics that are included as sort of staples of the genre that just have to be in the game for, well, gamey reasons, as well as a lack of focus on the emotional themes from the source material, make The Hobbit feel very gamey. Which again, as a reminder, in the context of this category doesn't mean that a game can't feel like a game, it's just that if there are things that are added only because it's a game, that's when things get weird, and they definitely do so in The Hobbit. Now, our final category, emotions. This is the most subjective part of Stasocritic, but it has the second biggest weight, 3. It's all about personal feelings, and they do matter quite a lot. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, you know by now that I absolutely love The Lord of the Rings. And back in the day, as a child, I would consume every Tolkien-related piece of media I would be able to get my hands on, obviously, games included. I have incredibly nostalgic feelings for The Hobbit. I must have beaten it so many times, really. And the music from this game was in my regular playlist for at least a decade after, if not more. So getting back into the Shire and hearing that fiddle theme simply has brought upon a rush of memories. And you know, a lot of times childhood favorites are not necessarily the best games, let's just say. Before replaying it, I decided to check what the reception of The Hobbit was back in the day. I found that it was exceptionally mediocre. But after actually replaying the game, I was honestly surprised. It deserves more recognition. There were a lot of unfavorable comparisons with Wind Waker, which I find weird because, I suppose art style aside, these games have literally different goals and purposes. Yeah, The Hobbit does make a bad Wind Waker style game, because it's not a Wind Waker style game at all. And you know that for my reviews I separate emotional reaction from what I find to be the actual quality of a game. So I find nothing wrong with liking pretty bad games, and I was assuming that it's gonna be the case for me here, that The Hobbit would be a deeply flawed game, but I'd like it nonetheless. But The Hobbit is a full-on, proper quality game. It's got fantastic level design, solid progression, and actually a pretty enjoyable pick-lock and minigame. Yeah, combat is clunky, but whatever. It's fun. I can safely say I would enjoy The Hobbit as much as I have, even without playing it as a child. And it might not fully represent the themes and points of the Hobbit story, but it's still a pretty solid adaptation, all things considering. This is why, should you open up all the scores for emotions, I will assign a 9 to The Hobbit. It's just a very nice experience, and I had great joy in exploring every nook and cranny the game had to offer, and I will gladly do so sometime again in the future. Let's summarize everything. After taking all the scores and their weights into account, the final Stasocritic rating of the 2003 Hobbit game for PC and consoles is 78. It is a really good game that deserves to be remembered more than it actually is. Especially considering the very messy development history. With all those complications, it is a miracle that The Hobbit turned out to be as good as it is. Some of these complications are behind the things preventing The Hobbit from being called a truly great game, but it is so close that it might as well be. Because The Hobbit is definitely a forgotten classic. If you like the world of J.R.R. Tolkien, play it, you won't regret it. If you don't care about The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings books at all but want a really solid platformer with some great level design, play it, you won't regret it. Yeah, some of the mechanics lack a bit of depth and some others are clunky, but it won't prevent you from enjoying this magical adventure of The Hobbit going there, and that's it actually. We don't really ever get back again. The game ends with saying that Bilbo's journey back to the Shire is a tale for another time. But you know what's not a tale for another time? This game. Let's make it less forgotten.